The Bob Murphy Show, episode 311.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be speaking with Sheldon Richman, who has currently wears, many hats in the Libertarian movement, and that's something I'll have him explain as we jump into the interview. But just so you know, one of his current posts is he's the executive editor at the Libertarian Institute. But beyond that, I'm reading his bio that's at the Independent Institute. Sheldon Richman is a research fellow at the Independent Institute. For 15 years, he was editor of The Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. Former vice president at the Future of Freedom Foundation, he is the author of America's Counter-Revolution, The Constitution Revisited, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax, and Tethered Citizens, Time to Repeal the Welfare State. So Sheldon is none too fond of coercion. So he and I go way back, and this is one of those episodes where really didn't have an agenda. I knew vaguely we were going to talk about his view on the conflict in the Middle East, and then his reflections on the liberty movement, let's call it, and lessons learned, that kind of thing, from someone who's been around the block. So those are the two main topics, but we really just had a conversation, and so it was very pleasant. Hope you enjoy it. Here's my discussion with Sheldon Richman. Sheldon, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm a fan.
Oh, and likewise. So as we were chatting before we hit the record button, I know that you're an OG of what I would call the liberty movement. And then number one, can you respond? Like, I think you said that you would phrase it differently, like both the term liberty and movement. So if you want to give me, your reaction.
Yeah, I don't make a big deal. I don't make a big deal of that. I don't object to the liberty movement. I would say, if I were talking to someone else, a libertarian movement, just because I've been using that word for lots of time, long time. Movement, people may or may not understand generally, both inside and outside the movement, that's a fairly informal thing. It's not like a single organization or even a constellation of organizations. I think if you just call yourself a small L libertarian and think about it and are interested in it, I can't end the movement. So it's broad.
Okay, fair enough. And then, but so can you just give a quick autobiographical sketch of how you came to this stuff, and then the people you interacted with and the organizations you've been affiliated with? Sure.
I mean, you use the term OG. I'm not a young guy. I mean, at times I feel kind of young, but I was born in the next to last year of the Truman administration. Sorry. The first year of his own term, 49. Toward the very end. I just made it the 40s. I was born the day after Christmas, so that's getting close to the end of the year. I was a great tax deduction for my parents because they could take it for the whole year, but they only had to put up with me for a few days. So I first started thinking about ideas, although I hadn't heard the word libertarian, in 1964, which is very typical for my generation. You're going to hear this story if you talk to other people my age, other libertarians. The Goldwater campaign. I had an older brother who unfortunately passed away many years ago, a long, long time ago. But he had a political awakening before I did. I was just a kid, 14, wasn't going to be 15 until the end of that year. But he started getting literature and badges and bumper stickers and telling me about it. And I always kind of liked stories about the American Revolution and related stuff. The idea of, individual liberty just appealed to me the first time I heard about it. It didn't take, I didn't have to say, well, that's weird. Why do we want to be free? I mean, no, it just, and my parents weren't, they were Republicans, but they weren't real political. So I wasn't getting it from them. I read Conscience of a Conservative, which was his perspective, Goldwater's perspective campaign book. And I forget who wrote that book, but it was ghosted by one or two people. But, it was generally good. I hadn't thought about foreign policy yet. He was a real hawk, of course, a real Cold Warrior. He didn't like just containment. So I was thinking more of, I thought, okay, well, I'm hearing about Russia and communism. Yeah, that's bad. And maybe we need to be nervous about it. This was the days, where you had to go under the desk, to save yourself from a nuclear war. Your desk would be, who knew those desks were so reinforced? I had no idea. They just seemed like, cheap wooden desks. So from there, people in high school would say to me, or as I got into high school, people would say to me, well, if you like that stuff, you need to read Henry Hazlitt's, you know how it goes, Economics 101. I never heard of that. And then send your name away to this place on Irvington on Hudson. It's called the Foundation for Economic Education. You don't need to send any money. Once you're on their mailing list, you're on your mailing list until your death. They never drop you. You'll get a free magazine. A little magazine was a little thing in those days. And so I started doing that. And then someone says, have you heard of Ayn Rand? My story is so typical. Mm-hmm. If you talk to a lot of people, a lot of libertarians my age, you'd be getting bored with it. You wouldn't put them all in your show because, here's another one. And then someone says, well, you got to read Murray Rothbard. And then you got to read Lord of Mises. Here, read Human Action. I'm going to give you a book, like this thing. Just read that, come back to me. And then I started associating with people. This was around the time that there was a Libertarian caucus within the Young Americans for Freedom, which was the William F. Buckley set up student young conservative organization, which had a budding libertarian, what we called it the Libertarian Caucus. And Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I was. I mean, I was raised in Northeast Philadelphia, Jewish neighborhood. And my parents were the only Republicans in that neighborhood. Everybody was a Democrat. They were Republicans. My father voted for Goldwater. My mother was scared by that nuclear bomb Daisy ad and voted for Johnson. But they're Republicans. They didn't vote for Kennedy in '60. So I started meeting these libertarian yaffers in Philadelphia. I mean, he even had an office. It was ironically in the Empire building, which was a fairly run-down building. We were anti-Empire. And then we went to this big conference in 1969. I was at the St. Louis YAF convention when the Libertarians ran a slate of people for the board. We did endorse the guy who was going to be the chairman. We figured, let's not bite off too much. We're not going to win that, but let's try to get some people on the board. And we were taunted as lazy fairies. Well, you can tell what that's a play on. I don't have to explain that. One of our guys burned his draft card and got pounced on by some, ex-Marines. It was great fun. Rothbard, meanwhile, in New York was saying, listen, YAF, and telling the libertarians, get out of YAF. What are you doing in St. Louis? So that's what we did. We got out of YAF after that. We got beaten. I don't think any of our people got elected. It was great fun. Murray wasn't there. Carl Hess was there, the great Carl Hess, who was a friend of Murray's at a certain time, and a guy I came to know better and kind of well. And we left and we set up the Society for Individual Liberty, which later became the International Society for Individual Liberty, and I don't even know what it's called these days. But that all began really in Philadelphia, but we had lots of people around the country. From there, in the 70s, I was attending conferences, the Center for Libertarian Studies, which began in New York City. I knew Rothbard. I'd been to his apartment a few times over the years. He was at my house once. I picked him up at the airport. He had a flight. He was speaking. I don't even remember why he was coming in, but I had to pick him up at the airport at midnight. He was coming in like some ungodly hour. We drove him to our house where we had a steak dinner for him. This is like the wee small hours of the morning before I then took him to his hotel. So I was on very good terms with him. I was involved in the LP for a while when he was, like in the Clark campaign. I chaired the platform committee. I became national vice chairman in 1981, served one term. In '83, I ended up leaving the party. It just gave up on it. So I knew him. I knew Leonard Liggio. I worked with Leonard Liggio at the Institute for Humane Studies. I worked with Walter Grinder, some of the greats that a lot of people unfortunately may not know, the younger people. Bob, you of course don't know these names. So I was really honored to know these people. I mean, I wasn't in their league. I wasn't like an original theorist. I tried to be a popularizer, maybe a synthesizer, and wrote on a popular level. I mean, I wrote some scholarly things. The Journal of Libertarian Studies, when Murray edited it, and it was still in New York, published, I think, 4 papers of mine that I wrote when I was doing some graduate work at George Mason University in history. I didn't stick with it because it was too busy. Anyway, so I guess I should talk about my affiliations real quickly.
Yeah.
My first real job in the movement was with a defunct organization called the Council for a Competitive Economy, which was supposed to be a free market equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce. In other words, oppose all the things that particular businessmen tend to like tariffs. First thing we fought was the Chrysler bailout of 1979, early 1980. Lee Iacocca, the charismatic chairman, would be on TV. They were having a real hard time, and they went to the Carter administration seeking a bailout. We opposed it. We took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, I believe, or Wall Street Journal. We were a Koch-created, funded organization back then. We lost that battle, by the way, with Chrysler. Chrysler got bailed out. From there, I did other things. I worked for the Institute for Humane Studies. I worked for the Cato Institute in the first half of the 90s. My affiliation now is the Libertarian Institute with Scott Horton. I was one of the founders and the late Will Grigg. I'm the executive editor, and I've been writing a column now for a long time called TGIF. Not thank goodness it's Friday, but the goal is freedom. And I continue it there, and occasional blog posts. That's what I'm up to. I think that covers it.
Yeah. So thank you. And I know that you and I have worked together. Like you commissioned, I don't know if that's the right verb, pieces for me when you were at various posts
at the Freeman. Yeah, did I not? I'm sorry, I left out the longest job I ever held. 15 years at the Foundation for Economic Education, although I wasn't physically there, editing the Freeman. I never held a job longer than about 5 years. That one went 15 years, and I'm very proud of that. And yes, you were one of my, for a couple of years there, one of my go-to people who could explain economic current controversies, like, for instance, Chinese currency manipulation, which was a big thing back then, earlier 2000s. You were one of the guys I could depend on.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So we talked, folks, Sheldon and I, about what does he want to talk about, and something that's heavy on his heart lately has been the situation with Israel. So, you take it away. How do you want to go ahead and
okay, I'll kind of riff, but break in with questions, because I don't really want to do a monologue. I get tired of hearing my own voice. Well, let me start off by saying I take no joy in talking about this issue, despite what some of my own family members probably think. I don't really like this. And when the events of October 7th occurred, I was kind of quiet for a while. It was like, what can I have nothing to say. I have nothing to contribute. I've already talked about this before. My voice is not going to make any difference. It's like the reason not to vote, right? What's my one vote going to do? However, I since then have done a few things, written a few things. I mentioned already that I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. Well, it's not a coincidence. My parents were moderately religious, what's called conservative, which is sort of that middle ground between Orthodox on one side and Reform on the other. There's a conservative ground, which thought the Reform were getting rid of too much Orthodoxy, but weren't Orthodox either. So they lived, typical middle-class lives. My father was a real estate broker, had his own office, single office, maybe one or two, at most two salesmen. It wasn't like a big thing. So we were comfortable. We lived in a decent middle-class and largely Jewish neighborhood. And my upbringing was moderately Jewish. Even when I gave up religion in the late 60s, early 70s, I didn't give up Israel, which is already indicative there. The people who the Jewish intellectuals and others who were concerned about the formation of Israel, and this goes back, I'm talking now, before 1900, said, if you do this, it will displace the real religion. It'll become a form of idolatry. The state, Israel, will take the place of God and the Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses, what lots of people think of as the Old Testament. And so I was an illustration of that. I could give up the whole religion, not keep kosher, not that we ever kept real strict kosher. In the house we did, but we'd eat out. So I brought up generally, my mother would always say, everybody's got to draw the line somewhere. That was how she navigated, that. What do you do? What do you not do? I could give all that up and even give up belief in anything supernatural and still think Israel, not that I wanted to move there. My parents never wanted to move there, but they visited, and I visited a couple times in the early 70s. As long as you were still faithful to Israel, then you were a Jew in good standing. Mm-hmm. So which is kind of strange, I think. Now, later in the 70s, I started encountering libertarians who said, let me give you some stuff to read. Because I used to be able to integrate it with my libertarianism, thinking, well, they bought land. They bought the land. What's wrong with that? And that was I kind of took that as a Lockean license. Mm-hmm. Everything else follows from that. I don't really need to think too much about it. It's not like they just barreled in there, I thought, and that's it. But then I start talking to people. Roy Childs, there's a name you might know. Roy Childs was a longtime editor of the Laissez-Faire Books catalog, worked for Cato, very well read, wrote lots of stuff, edited the Libertarian Review, a magazine that ran for several years. And I was talking to him one day and a few other people, and he said, you need to read a little bit. And Roy was someone I had a lot of confidence in. He wasn't someone who said, I'm a little skeptical of anything he says. No, he had a track record as far as I was concerned. And the book he recommended to me was David Hirst's, I have it on my shelf over there, called The Gun and the Olive Branch. Hirst is a British journalist. He's a reporter. And this book has gone through a few editions. It's about this thick now. And it's a what I call a very fair book. I mean, he points out where Arabs and Palestinians did pretty rotten things to Jewish people who were living there, even living there before the Zionist movement got going. So it's an even-handed book, but on the whole, it gives a story that's not real flattering to the Zionist movement. So I started doing that. I started reading that material and then meeting people, like a guy who Murray Rothbard claims is a friend, Rabbi Elmer Berger, the late Rabbi Elmer Berger, who lived in New York for a long time and knew Murray. Later moved to Florida, but he was one of the last great Reform anti-Zionist rabbis. And one of the things I was learning in this period was there was a Jewish anti-Zionist tradition that hardly anybody knows about. My parents wouldn't have known. Oh, well, one exception. My grandfather, who was Orthodox, my paternal grandfather, Sam Richman, I once heard him say, and I wish I'd asked him questions. It's one of those things that, can I go back and have one session with him? And I wasn't like a little kid, so I can't even blame that. This was around the time of the 67 war between the Arab countries and Israel. Maybe right afterwards. I don't remember all the details. So I would have been 17. That's old enough to ask questions. But I hadn't given up Israel yet. And I heard him, my mother, we used to go visit him on Saturday afternoons. We drive over, which, as good Jews, you should not drive. You can't drive.
Okay.
You can't drive on Saturday.
I knew enough to know that was,
We drove. The grandfather wouldn't have driven.
Right.
And his wife, my grandmother, these are my Zeta and my Bubba. I mean, that's what we called them, which is the Yiddish word for grandmother.
Can I stop you just for the better listener? Because
whenever you want.
Observant Jews are not supposed to do any work from Friday sunset to Saturday
Light a
sunset.
fire, gather firewood.
Yeah.
They would leave a burner on with a kettle of water, Friday night before sundown, because that's when Shabbos, the Sabbath, begins. And so that would be on all through Saturday until Saturday night when the sun went down and the Sabbath was over. So they always had hot water. I don't know if that's considered cheating or not. They didn't light it on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it was real fast. I just remember Richard Feynman, the physicist, had a thing where some I forget if he was in grad school or something, but some Orthodox, I think they were other students, asked him if electricity were fire. And he was trying to like explain, he didn't understand why they're, and then it turned, because they were trying to figure out, are we allowed to turn our lights on during Sabbath or something like that. And he got real mad thinking, oh, this is so goofy, because he was an atheist at that point. So anyway.
Well, I've heard that in Israel, the Orthodox get around this stuff. I mean, this is from a Jewish Israeli secular type who's not alive anymore, Israel Shahak, his name was, who was also a Palestinian rights advocate. But he would talk about how the Orthodox could get around this. So on Saturday, if they need to turn a light on, they have a thing rigged, or maybe there's even a commercial product, where if they open a window, it turns the light on. You can open a window. That's not considered work. But and if it triggers, if you set that up before the Sabbath and it turns your light on, that's okay. Or boys aren't allowed to listen to girls singing. So they have boys with very high voices recording the popular songs that's sung by female artists. So the boys can be listening to it may sound a lot like the maybe Taylor Swift or somebody, but since it's a boy or a guy imitating her with a high voice, that's okay. I mean, so anyway, we're not talking about the hypocrisy of Orthodoxy. That's not the point here. I started reading anti-Zionist stuff, mostly Jewish sources, but also non-Jewish sources, and I started reading the history.
So, but I interrupted. You were saying how your grandfather said something.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I missed the important point. So, my mother, who did not have a religious upbringing, was Jewish, but lived in very secular area of Florida, like Tampa, the Tampa area, Clearwater area, but became more Jewish for my father when they got married, when they met. So she must have been talking about what tough time Israel's having or how great they did in the war, something like that. And my grandfather said, the Jews are the cause of all the strife over there, all the trouble. I never heard anything like that. And she said, how can you say that? They have just one little sliver of land and all these Arabs want to drive them into the sea. You ought to go and visit. They made the desert bloom. You ought to go. And my grandfather would say, I wouldn't set foot over there. And he was the only guy with a voice in our family. He was sort of a cantorial voice. He wasn't a cantor, but he could do that. And he prayed 3 times a day. He managed a little synagogue. He walked over there. This guy was serious about this. So he would lead our Passover Seder for 2 nights. The first 2 nights you have a Seder. And we had a big extended family Seder, at least the first one. Maybe, I think even, no, 2 nights. And he would lead it. And, you read the story of the Exodus from Egypt, slavery, the Haggadah, it's called. And there's a line in there where it says, next year in Jerusalem. It's a famous line. It's right, a longing. The political types turned that into, yes, see, they wanted a state even back then. The other side says that's a spiritual longing. It's not political. My grandfather edited the line every year. He would say, next year in Philadelphia. That's where we already were. I don't think and the people would chuckle. My cousins and aunts and uncles would chuckle. And I probably chuckled too. I wouldn't have known what it meant. But none of them knew what it meant. Even my father, his son, my father's brother, his other son. I just think they took it as, that's just Sam, that's Shloim, that's Zeta being funny. I don't think he was being funny. Right, okay. So I read, but I never talked to him about it. He died in the 70s sometime. He was, he was pretty old. He was in his 70s, late 70s, I guess. I'm not sure we knew. He was from Lithuania, by the way. His wife was from Belarus, but they came over before World War I. Thank goodness, I might not be here otherwise. They lost family to the Nazis who didn't come here. Why they came so early, I'm not really sure. We don't know that story. That's a shame. And there's nobody left that generation. And the next generation, they're gone. So I don't know why he came so early, but thank you. Thank you. He came to America. He loved America, although he always claimed he was a socialist. He was a small businessman earlier in his life, he ran like a painting and paper hanging little business. You know, in fact, he'd do our house sometimes, I assume for free. He'd come in and put paper up on the wall or paint. But he would call himself a socialist. I wasn't sure why about that either. So anyway, I pursued my studies. I talked to people like Rabbi Berger, like Alfred Lilienthal, another very prominent Jewish anti-Zionist. He died, I don't know when he died, in the 90s, 80s, or 90s, but no, it would have been later than that. I knew him in the 90s, maybe the 80s too. So, and then I just read a lot. I watch, and I try not to shrink from debate. I read the other side. I look at the other side. Sometimes it's not fun to do. I mean, confirmation bias, I'm probably more conscious of confirmation bias than I've ever been in my life. You know, when you hear, oh, here's something that attacks your view, you get a little feeling in your stomach like, uh-oh, has this person discovered something I don't know or I can't answer? But then, if you work hard, you can overcome that. Everybody faces that. So I think that's my story, but feel free to ask questions.
Okay,
so we can talk about the current events, but go ahead and ask.
Yeah, so I mean, that's interesting. So I'm glad you gave that backstory just to show it's not that from birth you were rabidly anti-Zionist. But maybe one thing before you jump into your analysis of like the current events, I think the term Zionism gets, like, a lot of people are hearing, but if someone never actually had it spelled out to them, maybe now they're at the point where they're afraid to ask because it's like they'll look idiotic. So what, like, for example, a lot of people say, hey, to be anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. What does that mean?
Right. Well, to begin with the word Zionism, sometimes even I hesitate to use the term thinking, I know better, but it's as if that's a term that the anti-Semites came up with, and Jews, would never use that. So it sounds like such a bad thing, but that's of course not true. Zion refers to the Holy Land, the Promised Land, and there's a Mount Zion. So that word, comes out of that area, and the Zionists, the person who's considered the founder, although it had been talked about by other people, was Theodor Herzl. Right, who was a journalist, lived in Vienna, late 19th century, dies in 1904, so it doesn't get very far into the 20th century. He writes a book called, which it's typically translated, The Jewish State. Now, in German, I don't speak German, but I've done a little checking on this. This doesn't get pointed out very much. He was a totally secular person. In fact, he would have a Christmas tree. He didn't have his son circumcised. His first solution to the, quote, Jewish problem was to propose to the Catholic Church, because it was Austria-Hungary, Hungarian Empire at the time, but he proposed to the Catholic Church that all the Jews be converted. That was his plan A for solving the Jewish problem. The anti-Semitism, the lack of being able, inability to assimilate and be accepted by people around you as a real member of society. Those were real issues. I don't deny those at all. Well, the church didn't want to hear that, so he had to go to Plan B. Okay, let's get a state. Let's have a state. And he was willing to have it. He didn't even originally propose what was called Palestine, or what was the British mandate. Well, no, it wasn't the British mandate yet, because World War I hadn't happened. That's comes after World War I. But it was roughly known as Palestine in that area. And that wasn't even his first proposal. He thought of Uganda, I don't know, a few other places, some island off Africa. He just wanted, if we can't live in Europe, let's have our own place. Because he had covered the Dreyfus trial in France in the late 19th century, where Dreyfus was an assimilated Jewish, colonel? I forget what his office was in the military, and he gets framed as sending secrets to Germany. He didn't do it, and he was convicted. They tore the country apart over this. Now, one thing that tells you is at least half the country then was pro-Dreyfus, if it tore the country apart. Right. If it didn't tear the country apart, then maybe you do have a real problem. But there was a big division. He had covered it. And there's some myth around whether that really turned him into the Zionist he would become, Herzl now. But Herzl says it's the anti-Semites that make us Jews. In other words, he didn't really think of himself as Jewish. But now he sees, hatred being directed at a Jewish military member in France, where things seem to be going all right up till then in France. He says it's the anti-Semites that make us Jewish. So he forms this group, which becomes known as the World Zionist Organization. They use the word. So it is the word of the founders of this movement. But it wasn't well received by Jews. This gets back to the Jewish anti-Zionism, the unknown history, although there are some books on it if you want to look it up. When Herzl wanted to hold the first Congress of the World Zionist Organization, he wants to hold it in Munich. Interesting. But he can't hold it in Munich because the rabbis there protest and refuse and probably even complain to the authorities saying, don't let them gather here. Not exactly a libertarian position. But they didn't do it. That's why they met in Basel, Switzerland.
Why didn't they? They just thought it was going to stir up the public hatred.
They were anti-Zionist. They were anti-Zionist. It was a very minority view for a couple of reasons. The phrase "a land without a people for a people without a land" surfaces around this time. I think that's come up. A colleague of Herzl's named Israel Zangwill says that. So some rabbis go to Israel. Maybe this is apocryphal, but some go there, not to Israel, to Palestine, to check all this out anyway. And they write back, "You're right, it's a beautiful bride, but she's already married." In other words, there are people here. And Jewish intellectuals, there's a guy named Asher Ginsburg, who's a contemporary of Herzl's. His pen name is Ahad Ha'am. You might have seen that. He immediately writes about what he witnesses there. We got real trouble ahead. There are people here, and the Jewish attitude of the people that are going over there and in the writings about Zionism are very arrogant, as if these people don't matter. Why don't they just move out of the way? This is ours, going back, 2,000 years. Get out of the way. And he and others who called themselves spiritual Zionists or cultural Zionists protested political Zionism. For them, it was a spiritual thing. They wanted to renew Hebrew and Jewish consciousness around the world. And they might not have been in principle against the state someday, but this idea of let's have a political movement that just like barrels in there and get out of the way. We're back after 2,000 years. We're back. Thanks for holding it on, keeping us safe for holding on to it for us. But we're back now. You can go wherever. They warned about that, and that tradition carried on. So you have Orthodox anti-Zionists and you have Reform anti-Zionists. I think a lot of the Orthodox have now gone over, especially since 1948 with the actual formation of the state. But that's kind of the background of that term. Now, the conflation, the weaponization, I think, of anti-Semitism comes from conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Obviously, they're two distinct things. How would you have Jewish anti-Zionists if anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism were the same thing? Religious Jews, not just people who nominally call themselves Jewish, but religious Orthodox and religious Reform. That wouldn't make any sense. And to this day,
they've invented the term self-hating Jew, right? Is that what that is for?
That helps, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But now we're playing what? Now we're becoming old Freuds. We know who's self-hating.
Right.
As somebody once said, I forget who it was, I got a lot of reasons to hate myself. Being Jewish is way down on the list. I forget who said that. Some comedian, maybe. Must have been a comedian. Maybe it was Jerry Seinfeld. I don't think it was Jerry Seinfeld. But you can see how the Anti-Defamation League and the AIPAC, which is the main lobbying organization of the Israel lobby, can play on this because it silences people. We don't know how many people because they've remained silent, or it's discredited people who didn't remain silent. And you can understand why. Who wants to be accused of being an anti-Semite? Maybe David Duke doesn't mind, but most people don't want to be. Even anti-Semites don't want to be known as anti-Semites.
Right.
So that's going to shut a lot of people up who say, why do I need to hassle? Yeah, I don't like what Israel's doing to Palestinians, but gosh, I don't want to wade into that. Especially, what are the benefits? My voice is not going to change anything anyway. It's again, we're back to the voting paradox, right? So a couple of years ago, what's called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, you probably remember this controversy, came up with a definition of anti-Semitism. And it was something like having a certain attitude toward Jews. It didn't say what the attitude was. Having an attitude toward Jews, and here's some examples. And it gave 11 examples, and I think 7 of them were about Israel. So if you say Israel, I think Israel's a racist country, leave the merits of that claim aside. Okay, you can argue about what does it mean to be racist. But if you just say that, that's an example that the IHRA and all their fans, including like the State Department of the United States, I mean, they adopted that stuff, the Education Department. That's considered an example of anti-Semitism. And I just think that's pernicious. And I think the real intention here is to inoculate Israel, the Israeli government, against criticism. And a lot of the Israeli people's attitudes, it's not just the government. I think the public very much share, the polls seem to show, very much share this, a very aggressive attitude. It's what others, even the Israeli Human Rights Organization, B'Tselem, calls a Jewish supremacist attitude. And I think it's to inoculate Israel from criticism, because you risk being called an anti-Semite. Well, that's very, very bad.
To me, what I think there are two things that jumped out. They were always sort of under the surface, but really came to the forefront, since October 7th, is lots of people making perfectly reasonable criticisms of, hey, I don't think Israel should be engaged in so much bombing. Like, look at all these innocent kids that are getting killed. Yeah. And then that is construed as, oh, so you don't, you think the Jews should be pushed into the ocean. Right. It's like, no, right. I didn't say that. Right. But then on the other hand, I've been surprised, I guess maybe me being naive, at how much open, like genuine anti-Semitism you do see, just like if someone makes a comment and then someone will, I forget the way they even do it, but like to signify the person's Jewish, like if someone defends central banking and someone be like, oh, well, look, the guy's a Jew. So, you know how that is. Like, you know what I mean? It's somewhat like a lot of it, I think, is just kind of like young kids just trolling and being like, they know,
sure,
this shocks people, so I'm going to do this. And they don't really, it's not that they really like Adolf Hitler kind of thing. But whatever it may be, prima facie, I was somewhat taken aback at how much openly, or with the Kanye West stuff, that recently broke. And I think some of that was taken out of context or whatever, and some things were but no, I mean, he was saying stuff that 5 years ago I would not have predicted somebody like that would be saying openly. And so anyway, it seems like there's both, both sides can see what they want to think, yep, we're totally right in this.
I think that when we discuss things like this, and it's not the only subject where what I'm going to say applies, is I think two words have to be avoided: all and none.
Yeah.
Very, very dangerous. Now, I realize this is not an era of nuance.
Yeah.
On anything. Nuance, I think, is perceived as wishy-washiness. So maybe I'm going to come across as wishy-washy but I insist on being nuanced. Things like what's going on now will always bring out the creeps. That's true. Mm-hmm. My problem with the other side, the people that are sort of the, to the very end defenders of Israel, no matter what they do, Israel right or wrong, well, because I don't think it's ever wrong. Israel right or right, because it can't be wrong. They want to portray it all as anti-Semitic. And that's false. At the same time, it's wrong to say, none of it is anti-Semitic. The problem is, in any given case, telling what's anti-Semitism and what's not. I mean, because two outward behaviors, one could be anti-Semitic and one can be simply anti-Zionist. It's not always clear unless the person, really states his views, like Jews control everything, all the banks, all the press. It's a problem. We got, that person's showing their cards. But that's not typically what happens. Let me take an example. I think this was yesterday or the day before. It was all over the news. There's a statue of the late Amy Winehouse, who was like a jazz singer, who I guess committed suicide or died of an overdose. She had
I think it was an overdose, yeah.
Real drug problems, very good voice. And so not an old person. and there's a statue of her in London. I didn't even know there was one. So I get a alert on my phone from Spiked magazine, which is a kind of a populist. It used to be a kind of a Marxist, but it's now very sort of populist. I mean, that kind of like Trump, almost. Alert from them saying that the statue was defaced because on her statue she's wearing a pendant with a Jewish star. Mm-hmm. Now you don't know if that's a Jewish star or if that's a star of the state of Israel, because the state of Israel picked up the Star of David, right? The six, the two triangles inverted, the six-pointed star. So I don't know why she wore it. I looked it up quickly. She didn't seem to have any views on Israel that I could find, and not much of a religious upbringing. But that's irrelevant. Somebody had put over there a sticker with the Palestinian flag. When they say defaced, that's all it was done. It wasn't like broken. At first, I wasn't sure what happened, but that's all it was. Now, I'm not defending that. I think that's disgraceful. I also don't know why a person did that. That doesn't mean I'm not sure that person necessarily is an anti-Semite. Maybe too, but I'm just saying in any given case, how can you really know? I mean, I can't read somebody's heart or mind or conscience and know why they're doing something. But yes, there are anti-Semites and will gang up on this. Although, in years past, anti-Semites were in favor of Zionism. It was like, what, the Jews, there's a state for Jews now? Hey, that's a great idea. I'll pack their bags.
Right.
How soon can we get you on a plane? I mean, that's seems like a natural combination of positions. I don't like Jews. Right. Jews, go over there. There's your country in the Middle East. Get out of London or New York or whatever it is.
So, yeah, sort of like white American racists wanting black people to go back to, here, let me, then it's like.
Yeah, so it's not so simple. Now, today, I take it from what I read, anti-Semites tend to be anti-Zionists. So anti-Semites like Arabs? Okay, that's news to me. That's news to me too.
That is interesting you're right with the deface. Like if you were watching, a Star Wars movie and there were monuments all over, to the Emperor or to Darth Vader or something, and then someone came up and put a little sticker of like Luke Skywalker's face or Yoda's face on it and then snuck away before the stormtroopers caught him, you wouldn't think, oh wow, that person's bigoted. You would say, no, they're like, doing some counter propaganda to try to stand up to the empire. And so they wouldn't be motivated by hate. That would be like in protest of, geez, the empire just blew up that planet of Alderaan and killed all those people. So I'm going to, go ahead and alter the propaganda they're putting out with these statues. So,
right. But they should, to be clear, so I'm clear, not for you. I know you get what I'm saying, but to be clear to anybody, they should leave the White House statue alone.
Yeah.
Leave her alone. She's dead. She can't talk. She can't defend herself. I don't even know I'm not sure she's accused of anything, but you don't do that. You just don't do that. I don't like that sort of thing. I condemn it. I mean, even if it's just anti-Zionist, I condemn it, whether it's anti-Semitic or not. So there are bad people on the other side too, who do bad things. If someone says, and there's I believe unconfirmed report that in Australia, there was a street demonstration after the late unpleasantness in Gaza. It's been reported that people were chanting, something like "gas the Jews." Now, it's been I tried to find out the truth about it. It seems unconfirmed, and no one seems to even have an audio of it. Maybe it happened. I'm not saying it didn't happen. If it happened, I don't have much trouble believing that's anti-Semitic. First of all, it's stupid. Who's leading the street demonstrations and helped close down Grand Central Terminal a few months ago? Jewish Voice for Peace, and Not in Our Name. These are Jewish organizations, and it's not just in the United States. Now, I don't give my approval to shutting down terminals or blocking streets. I think protest needs to take other forms. That's a separate issue. But the point is, why would you make some kind of anti-Jewish remark when Jews, especially younger Jews, are leading the charge against Netanyahu's conduct of this? I won't even call it a war. War usually has two armies, shooting at each other. The slaughter in Gaza. and also, the routine daily humiliation and I think oppression of the West Bank Palestinians. I mean, things aren't rosy there. So that's kind of my attitude. Look, the Hamas people and some non-Hamas people apparently also came through that fence on October 7th and did terrible things, unspeakable things, and took hostages, bad stuff. We know now, even from Israeli sources, they didn't kill all the people. There was actually friendly fire. Those numbers we don't know, but there was some friendly fire. Very, very, I mean, what can I say? Terrible stuff. I don't agree with people who won't condemn them. Norman Finkelstein, who I agree with a lot of his historical analysis on this stuff and is, very critical of Israel, while he calls it an atrocity, what Hamas did, he won't condemn Hamas, which I think is ridiculous. If you're calling something an atrocity, I think you've already condemned it. You need to also use the word condemn. There aren't good atrocities and bad atrocities, as far as I'm concerned. That's a moral term. So he's wrong about that, but he won't do it, and I think that he's full of it for that reason. They did terrible, terrible things, but I agree with the Secretary General of the UN, and I've never said those words before. I've never agreed with this. But he said, a couple of days later, he said two things. Nothing can justify, well, he said three things. Nothing can justify what Hamas did on the 7th. Nothing can justify, that cannot justify what Israel is now doing in Gaza. And then he went, the third thing, which got him into so much trouble, even calling for his firing. What happened on October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. Just saying that got him into trouble. Now, he didn't get fired. Enough people, I guess, most of the UN are not going to fire him over that. But Israel called that anti-Semitic. But that's true. It's not removing blame. I mean, somebody could use it to remove blame. I wouldn't use it to remove blame for the people that committed those atrocities on the 7th. But it's still true that history didn't begin on October 7th. Just the way an Israeli would never say history began on October 8th, would they? They'd say, oh no, look at the 7th. Well, a lot of people who sympathize with the Palestinians say, you're looking at the 7th. How about looking at 1948, 1967, and on and on and on. So
with that stuff, I guess the problem is that, depending which side you're listening to and the person defending one particular side's actions, they can just pick the framing. So like, a believing Jew would say, well, go back to, look at the, God gave the land to, told Moses / Joshua that go in, it's yours, and God created everything so he can give it as he pleases. And so obviously secular people are going to say, well, that's not really a legitimate claim, but I guess my point is, like, what principle do you use just to say it doesn't matter what the history is?
Not all secular people, because I take it Walter Block is secular, but he believes there's a biblical claim. But what he doesn't, even if you start back 2,000 years ago, when allegedly the Romans exiled the Jews, there's a historical work by a guy named Shlomo Sand, who's an Israeli historian, who says there's not even a single book on the exile of 70 AD. There was no exile, in other words. There's not a single book documenting it. It's always mentioned in popular stuff, but nobody ever shows it. But Block talks about that. He says the Romans threw Jews off the land. So what's wrong if they're genetic descendants? Genetic. They don't have to be like really direct relatives, right? It's my great, 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 great to the X-power grandfather lived in that house, so I want it. That would be a dicey claim anyway, but he doesn't even make that kind of claim. It's just that our people were there. But that's starting the movie too late. How'd they get there? I've read the 5 books of Moses and then the book of Joshua. They didn't buy the land. It was wasn't that a genocide? Wasn't that an ethnic cleansing? They might have had God told them to do it, maybe. You can argue about that. But they went in and slaughtered everybody. So how can conquest be the fruit of a legitimate ownership? So that would be my challenge to block. My take is,
right. Just to be clear, though, that's why I'm saying you'd had someone would have to believe
Yeah.
in God and Yahweh or whatever that
Yeah, but
he would have the
I
authority to tell people.
I
That's why,
don't
yeah.
think,
If you were,
I'm not sure. I don't think Block is a believer. Maybe it's
oh,
wrong.
last,
Block's enough. I could have mentioned Block in my first little answer to you. I knew Block way back then too, in 1960, 68, 69. Oh, back then. If he's a believer, it's news.
oh,
to me.
I don't think he is. He
Okay.
wasn't as of the last time.
But he holds on to the biblical story as hard as any believer does.
Right.
So it's not even a secular religious line. It's not a very clear line. As I understand international law, I'm not a lawyer, and much less than that, an international lawyer. Biblical stuff has no standing. So you couldn't go before the world court and say, my people occupied Judea and Israel, the two kingdoms, once they divided into two kingdoms, way back in whatever it was, BC. That has no standing, as I understand it, which makes sense because why stop there? Almost any place on earth could have some ancestors come back saying thousands of years ago, my people lived here. You kicked them off. I mean, Thomas Sowell, there's much to be learned from Thomas Sowell. And his book on conquests and cultures and migration and culture, very valuable stuff. That's been the history of the world from the day people could walk, I guess, and get around on 2 feet. They conquered other people. I'm not happy about this. It's not pleasant. Who knows what history would have been like. We'd all be a lot richer, I guess, if Mises had lived back then and said, hey, instead of fighting, we could be getting gains from trade. What are we doing? Division of labor. Come on. Unfortunately, he didn't write that until later on in the 40s, the 1940s of AD. Everybody conquered everybody. Slavery is a very old story. I mean, the woke types make us think, it was all invented by white Westerners. That's nonsense. That's total historical ignorance. And you know this stuff, and your audience is going to know this stuff. Everybody enslaved everybody. I even learned from Thomas Sowell that the Maori on New Zealand, who on TV shows are always portrayed, I'm sure they were oppressed by the English when they got there, the people they sent there. But they're all on the TV, on current TV in fiction, like the police stuff, because I've watched a few New Zealand shows. They're always portrayed as very pacifistic, and the legacy of their being conquered and suppressed. Sowell says that in the 1830s, they conquered an island to their east and enslaved that population. I don't know the name of the island, to the east of New Zealand. And the Maori were once slaveholders. And we know Africans were slaveholders. We know Arabs were slaveholders. Whites were slaves. Slavs, the word comes from Slav. They're white. So nobody's got a monopoly on this kind of oppression. So I don't like even the critics of Israel, who I otherwise would side with, and who would consider themselves left or radical left. I get very annoyed with them because I think they hurt their own case by saying Zionism is just another case of white supremacist imperialism or colonialization, and I don't think that's right. I think there's something unique about Zionism, which is not to give it a free pass. That's not my point. But I don't think it should just be folded in and then you use your regular template and talking points against, white supremacist empire, because that also contains an anti-capitalist element. If you listen to them long enough, when they talk about decolonialization, they want to throw a lot of baby out with the bathwater. This is something that Peter Bauer, the great free market development economist, used to write about. They want to get rid of stuff that they shouldn't get rid of, like trade, division of labor, like private property. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Just looking at the clock here, I want to give some time to this last topic that we intended to bring up. So you had mentioned, as we were corresponding about doing an episode with you, your outlooks on the case, or the prospects for liberty are bleak, is I think the word you use. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I don't like talking. There's another one I could take no joy, another subject I take no joy in talking about. I certainly don't want to spread any negative attitudes to libertarians, especially younger ones who,
Mm-hmm.
I can identify with. I was once young and idealistic, and we used to say freedom in our time, FIOT. That was our kind of our salute to each other. We held up one finger for the I, right? Me. Rand was a big influence on us too, but we also were reading the other people, including Murray. But we would say freedom in our time. Well, here I am, I'm 74 and I don't see freedom in my time, but I don't want to put a wet blanket over the younger generation or even your age, people your age. But I'm just getting really bad vibes. I mean, I watch a lot of YouTube and I try to watch all kinds of points of view and libertarian debates among the 6 people who are going for the nomination for the LP and the fights within the LP and the takeover by the Mises Caucus last year. And, I keep up on that. I'm not in the party. And also, of course, we got to convince a lot of people who don't think of themselves as libertarians now. I mean, this is really the point. It's not a debating club. And I've always been a big believer in reason. Reason was one of my favorite words. And I think I believed that even before I read Ayn Rand. But, and I always liked Aristotle. And so I like reason. But I'm just feeling we're in an era where trying to persuade someone is a futile act. People aren't persuadable. I mean, I listen to arguments, even when I disagree with them, and I try to think them over. I really believe it's very important to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and see what it is he's saying. Not to say, okay, you're probably right about this, not that. But, it's a John Stuart Mill kind of idea on liberty, which is a great plea for freedom of speech and press. At least half the book, the other half is kind of a related subject. But he said, take the strongest case of the other person, of the other side. Go to their strongest advocate. Don't go to somebody on your side and say, summarize that view we both hate. That's not what you do. And you have to also use the principle of charity, which take the best interpretation, the strongest interpretation. One of my beefs with what we call the left, although I don't think these terms mean anything. I don't know if you're aware of the book by those Lewis brothers, those 2 guys, Verlin and Hiram Lewis, on the myth of left and right. Very interesting book about those terms. Just are a hodgepodge of positions with no underlying logic, and they can easily the two could easily switch positions, and we know they've done that on like intervention with Russia, views toward Russia. Right. It used to be a Republican right wing sort of thing. Left was against it. Now they switched.
Right.
It's contingent. It's not because they consulted their an underlying principle. So one of my problems with the left is that I hear like Max Blumenthal and people like that, who I don't know these people. I only watch them. They never steel man. We have this expression now, steel man, which comes from the opposite of straw man, right? They never steel man the other side. And not that I think the other side is good. I mean, I disagree with them. The interventionists, the people that think we ought to be trying to weaken Russia through Ukraine, down to the very last Ukrainian and our last dollar. Well, we're actually way past our last dollar because we're deep in debt. You certainly talked enough about that stuff. I want to know why the other side thinks we ought to be doing something else. I don't like to just reduce it to the military-industrial complex. That's too Marxist, materialist for me. I think it's much more than that. I think it's ideology. As my friend Jeff Hummel always says, ideas rule the world. I don't think the bottom line of Lockheed Martin. Now they may applaud the policy because they can make some money off it, but maybe they believe it too. Somebody once said, if this country is worth saving, it's worth saving at a profit. Maybe they believe that. Maybe they sincerely believe this new Cold War stuff, that Russia and China are dangerous to us, and Iran. They could believe that. And I don't think they're right, but it's not an insane position. It's something you can imagine someone believing, given a worldview, and still think there's money opportunities. I can sell stuff to the government, and in pursuit of this. So both things are possible. What bothers me about the left is they reduce it to one thing, and I don't trust that. They're also anti-free market. They're anti-capitalist, and I don't trust that. So I'm just getting the sense that reason doesn't have clout with people. I'm not saying there aren't any exceptions, of course, but really, is the LP going to convince people of anything? And it's not a criticism of the LP. I just don't think the public is receptive to it. That goes for national divorce and all this stuff, all these things that are being talked about, regardless of your position on the particular issue. So that's kind of why I'm feeling pretty bleak. I mean, I'm feeling like, well, why speak up? It's like voting. We're back to this the third time I've made this analogy. Why should I walk to the polls and I wouldn't have to drive? Why walk? It's not going to make any difference. So why say X? It's not going to make any difference. So I've been on social media very little, a little bit lately, probably because of Gaza, but I pretty much dropped off it. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, yeah, you did. And that's actually partly why I think I decided to start openly pushing for Texas secession, is because, you don't need to, all you got to do is convince enough people to say, hey, do you agree that you would object if the federal government started bombing them if they did that? But, it's not that you got to get a bunch of people to, say, yes, I think it'd be a great idea if Texas broke away, just as long as, enough public opinion was against punishing them with violence. That's all you would need. For precisely the reason you say that, yeah, it's funny. Maybe everyone goes through this cycle. When I was in my young 20s, I really just, I wrote for a website called antistate.com, and we had a forum that people could join and, talk about ANCAP ideas and private police forces and military defense and And that the membership was just growing over time. And I remember doing extrapolations and thinking, okay, so by this date, at this rate of growth, 15% of the U.S. population is going to be anarcho-cap, and that didn't happen. So it was, it was more like the few people who believed it found the website, and some of them joined and some of them didn't, and then that's what I just noticed in the upstream. And it wasn't that we were going. But at that point, I just thought, well, no, these ideas are so obvious, and wouldn't everyone's default be to not use coercion? And if we can just show them that, this is why the state, as you conceive it, is unnecessary for social cooperation and peace and harmony, blah, blah, everyone will just see the light. And at this point now, it's like, oh no, people are so, like you say, they know what they want the answer to be, and then they'll backfill a rationalization for it. So everybody on the surface is arguing with logic and facts and whatever, but you kind of you can see that, no, you're not even listening to what the other side is saying. You're not even trying.
It seems more tribal than ever these times. Now, I don't want to fall prey to looking back at a golden age, because if you go back to that golden age, there are people saying the very same thing. Oh, if only we could go back to an earlier golden age. To give it a little perspective, in Aristotle, you can find the words, the ancient philosophers said. Mm-hmm. Okay, he's saying that in 400 BC. So I'm aware of that danger, that I may be a codger thinking, what about the good old days?
Right.
When you could argue and possibly, and also leave on good terms, even if you haven't convinced the other. I used to be able to argue with my older brother, my late brother, and I remember doing this over the phone about Israel. He was very pro-Israel. He lived for a year or more in Israel in a kibbutz, met his future wife there. And he knew my position. I knew his position. And he wasn't a religious person. I'm sure he was an atheist. He called himself an agnostic, but I think he was afraid to call himself an atheist. Mm-hmm. He was a cowardly atheist. But we would argue for hours about Israel, and it never got unfriendly. It was collegial. It was friendly. It was constructive. I don't think either moved the other. We might have each learned something, but our positions didn't change. My position didn't change. His position didn't change. But it was so friendly. I realize this is like two people. Mm-hmm. These days, I can't talk to my family that's still around. They don't want to talk about it with me. I mean, I've been told terrible things. By people close to me have told me I'm an apologist for terrorists, mm-hmm. for merely saying there's no evidence Iran ever tried to develop a nuclear weapon. All you need to do is read Gareth Porter's Manufactured Crisis, very well documented book. They never actually tried to build one. Or another person close to me said, because of my views, and because I published this book on coming to Palestine, which I'll put a plug in for, Amazon.com. I was told by a close relative, you're an accomplice in the next Holocaust. That's a pretty nasty thing to say.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a pretty bad thing to say to somebody, especially since when it couldn't be further from my view. So people don't seem to talk to each other. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe people have experiences which will talk me down from this. I'd be very happy to hear about it. I mean, I like to be wrong. A lot of things I'd like to be wrong about. Many things.
So I think. Well, let me throw out a theory, and you tell me what you think about it. Or it's a hypothesis. It's not a fully fleshed out theory.
Right.
I think there are two significant things that I think are partly to explain. One is the rise of social media, and specifically the mechanism being without the standard gatekeeping. So now you get to see not just what the best of the people who've been through some sort of vetting procedure representing each side's take, but you can see what the masses feel like, and so therefore on some issue, if 5% of the people are very articulate and well thought out, and they are trying to steelman the opposition, and then the other 95%, I forget what percentage I said, are just completely tribalistic and like, oh yeah, that's it doesn't surprise me that you would say that, you retard, and and all that stuff. That kind of makes you jaded, and then you think, okay, well, what's the point? These people are idiots. Look at them. I'm not inventing this. Go ahead and look. And then when both sides start seeing that day in and day out, and then also that fuels, like with more open entry into the punditry class, let's say, who rises to the top. It's not the most soft-spoken, well-mannered people. It's like the most bombastic are the ones that then become, the biggest in that genre. And so, like somebody who's like has the same views as Alex Jones, but he's more toned down a little bit, is not going to all of a sudden become more popular than Alex Jones. And so, and I'm not even saying that I'm just picking him as an example of what I mean. Or like with Paul Krugman, there were plenty of Keynesian macroeconomists who are just more polite than he was, and wouldn't just say George Bush is a war criminal and whatever, and hates poor people, and the Republicans are all evil, and that's the only possible explanation for their behavior is they just want poor people to suffer. There are plenty of macroeconomists who had the same economic views as him, but were more respectful of but you don't hear them because Krugman, his fans liked him more because he was more over the top. So anyway, I think that's might be part of it. And then the other thing was just with Trump, like news organizations openly. I remember I've said this a few times, where I heard someone on NPR during the Trump administration actually explain to the listeners and saying, we've made an editorial decision from now on when President Trump says something false, we are going to say in our coverage, which is not true, or claims without evidence, whereas they never used to say that even about the crazy third world dictator. They never used to say that. They would just openly, and so the president of the country claims that how indeed they might find a critic and quote the critic to say, however, human rights groups disagree with the claim, saying blah, blah, blah. But here they said with Trump, no, we are going to actually, as NPR, say he is wrong on this. And that to me was kind of a qualitative, like, oh, he's the first world leader who's lied in history. That's interesting.
I never liked Trump. I don't like anything about him. But I will say that there is such a thing as Trump derangement syndrome. Mm-hmm. The way I like to put it, and I've been thinking this and said it to a couple of people for years now. I despise Trump, and I despise most of the people who despise Trump.
Yeah.
So that's how I put it. Look, you were mentioning technology, social media, plenty to do with it. I've always used my whole name, but even that, the fact that you're not face to face with people does make people free to be more insulting or obnoxious than they would ever be in person. I'm sure that's true. I love technology. So, I can go online and look at the latest pictures of my grandkids on Facebook, which is one of the few reasons I go on, or see my two grown daughters or my son. He doesn't post so much, or listen to his music on YouTube Music. So I'm a big fan of it. But there's, everything has a downside. To mention Thomas Sowell again, famous line of his, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I think that's the world we live in. That's always been the case, but it's really illustrated by some of this. There's plenty of things to complain about thanks to social media. And some of it serious, I'm not denying that. but think of all the good too. And I'm not telling you. You
Right,
understand this. I mean, after all, here we are talking.
Yeah.
You're in the New England. I'm in Arkansas. And I remember back years ago when I was debating whether the UN needed to do something about overpopulation, which, I was a Julian Simonian. The answer is no. We need more people. I remember on NPR, I was debating somebody, and I was in the studio in DC, and this person was in the studio in Wisconsin, and I was attacking the idea that the Earth has a carrying capacity, for human beings, despite what they are for butterflies and rats and bacteria in a petri dish. And the woman said, "Are you saying we're different from the other animals?" And I said, "You're in Wisconsin, and I'm in DC, and there's not even a wire connecting us, and we're talking as if we're in the same room. Do I need to answer your question?"
Yeah.
So people forget that, and people don't have perspective today. That's the other thing. Libertarians, I hope, do because they run into all the great progress that's been made over the years, and the fall in absolute poverty, and just unbelievable statistics thanks to globalization and markets. I know globalization is a dirty name, so there's two kinds. There's government managed and there's laissez-faire, and we were a little closer to laissez-faire, maybe considerably closer to laissez-faire a bit earlier. There was always a management. These free trade agreements always had management, absolutely. But to say there's been no progress in that, I don't make sense either. So, outside of politics, there's a lot of great things going on. Inside of politics, not so much. If you can find one or two bright spots, maybe. But
So, can I just ask you?
Yeah. Anything?
Is it that? Are you saying that younger people interested in advancing the prospects for liberty in their lifetimes? Are you just saying, instead of trying to go out and persuade people or get the right candidates or whatever, maybe you should focus on something else? Is that more what you mean, or you're not even saying that? You're just saying.
I'm really reluctant to give anybody advice.
Okay.
Maybe I'm missing something. Like I said, somebody talk me down. If someone wants to get in contact and tell me what I'm overlooking, my standard question is, what am I missing? Which is that's not rhetorical. I could well be missing something. So, and like I said, I'd love to be shown wrong. So I don't want to give anybody advice. If your comparative advantage is communicating, writing, speaking. Today it's much more speaking than writing, because I don't know, are people reading books these days? I don't know. Then maybe that's what you should be doing. Assuming you can make a living at it too. You need to make a living. Then I wouldn't say, "Oh, don't do that. You're not going to convince anybody." Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's an important group of people out there that's just primed for. They just need to hear this and say, "Oh wow, I never thought of that before." Well, yeah. How come no one ever told me that? I would hate to steer somebody off a track they're really determined to go on in communication and advocacy if that's what they want to do. Prove, I'll hand down a challenge. Prove me wrong, please.
Well, I remember I was disillusioned in 2008, like in the fall, with the financial crisis, and how many people that were certainly called themselves conservatives and even libertarians. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was a Republican in the White House, which, shouldn't matter, were defending, what we call colloquially the bailouts. And I remember thinking, what is the point of all of the free market writing that, I've done and other people have done and all these, institutions we have, if we can't even get in a moment like this, just, again, a bunch, like a hardcore group that will just come out and say, no, you shouldn't bail out the banking system. Like that's bad morally and economically. And just to see how quickly, because were worried and Paulson came out and told them some scary stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, well then, we need hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts. Like and how fast they rolled over.
George Bush said we need to destroy the free market to protect it.
Yeah.
Did those libertarians that you're talking about never think there was going to be a crisis? It's happening today with foreign intervention, right? With Ukraine and with Israel. There are libertarians, and I'm in a little group that talks about this and kind of laments it, little online group, of libertarians, they tend not to be historians. We've noticed a pattern. There are other things besides historians. They're like philosophers or legal scholars or something like that, who want to totally back Ukraine and totally back Israel. And so if they gave lip service to non-intervention previously, oh, well, we didn't mean this in these cases.
Right.
And so I wonder what the older libertarians, Rothbard and others, would be saying. I mean, who knows? Rothbard's a little unpredictable. I'm not saying he would have backed these, but you couldn't always. Yeah, he once was pro-immigration. Mm-hmm. I'll just put it that way. But earlier in the early '80s, he was pro freedom of immigration, which is not a subject you and I won't get into now, I'm sure. But yeah, I don't understand. Are they fair weather libertarians that sort you're talking about, and now that I'm talking about too? It's so that they seem to cave immediately, and I'm sure it happened on COVID too. And I don't want to, I wasn't writing a lot about COVID. There was a lot going on here. I never endorsed any, but I certainly didn't do what Jeff Tucker and others were doing, which delved into a totally new subject, like how's a virus behave? I mean, what do I know about that? Nothing. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't saying a lot, but I wasn't backing it. I know that.
Right.
But I wasn't forward on it. Tom Woods, of course, was. And that's why they can he and others can compile books of their writings from back then. I mean, I couldn't do anything like that. I wrote 1 or 2 articles. And, if it happened again, I'd know a lot more now. But I wasn't, it just wasn't I wasn't in a place where I could suddenly, pick up books on virology or study the Spanish flu from 1919 or 1819, whatever. And like some people did. And, I didn't have my voice. On the other hand, would one more voice have turned things around? I really don't, and mine especially. I don't think so. I don't think I would have convinced Fauci.
So I guess what I'm saying though is that, yeah, I had that moment of discouragement and realizing, oh, wow, this is that I had thought before the fall of 2008 that there was a solid group of people that, had standard basic free market principles under their belt. And yeah, if just because there was this ostensible financial crisis that they wouldn't, just cave so easily. And when that happened, I realized, oh, wow, the support here is like what I thought we were doing, like me and my libertarian economist buddies and all the writing and great speeches we're giving and all the YouTube views. I realized that my view of what our stronghold was overrated. That no, actually the group that we have that are really committed to these principles and understand it is smaller than I had thought.
Yeah, my one personal pride from that era was I wrote an article, I was still at the Freeman, called "Wall Street Couldn't Have Done It Alone," because you had Occupy Wall Street come along right at that time, which kind of overlapped. Wasn't there some overlap at the Tea Party?
I think so.
Overlap.
Yeah.
So I did, and I purposely did it so that it would fit on one page. It was a bunch of bullet points, maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15. I was really happy with it. And the point is, if it was one page, you could do a flyer, right, and give it out like and it even got on Counterpunch, which is a left-wing, in some sense, a left-wing publication, right? It was Alexander Coburn and other people. He died. I don't know what exactly he died. But yeah, they're not publishing pro-capitalist stuff. Although I used to be able to get in there even with pro-capitalist stuff. So for some reason, they liked me. Coburn liked me for some reason. And his successor liked me, his partner. And that was in the Freeman and got into other places. So that was my one contribution, that the people that wanted to say, see, and even Greenspan even said, remember he testified in Congress saying, yeah, I was wrong. I was wrong thinking a free market would work. I forgot, I forget exactly how he put it. You probably have better memory of that than I do. But he basically did a mea culpa, right? Forgive me, I believed in laissez-faire. That's what caused all this.
Yeah, I'm trying to. You're right. It was something like my faith in the market was over. Something like that. Yeah.
Did Ayn Rand spin in her grave? I wonder.
So, I guess where does that leave us then? Is it just you're saying? So that, like, for me, that's why I've sort of pivoted. So yeah, I will still, of course, occasionally release episodes like here on the Bob Murphy Show about the mechanics of a purely free society, and here's how it would work, just to occasionally remind people of this vision. But in terms of my day-to-day efforts now, I am, like I say, focusing on anything involving politics is more I'm focusing on secession. And then I even picked Texas to make it a very concrete, specific thing as opposed to just the broad, national divorce thing.
We'll have to have a talk about
doing stuff in the financial sector, like building, real world solutions to things to give some, because again, that's like the model for me is Uber. Instead of writing essay after essay about getting rid of the taxi cab medallion, the medallion system, just somebody founding Uber and then, arguing that, hey, the local city council shouldn't ban Uber. To me, that's a way better way to show people and to get more competition in their lives.
Yeah. First of all, I like your show a whole lot, and the other one you do, the Human Action, because one of the things you've done there that I learned so much from, and I almost always email you the next day. You'll testify to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saying good show. You teach libertarians something. I mean, maybe you're primarily talking to libertarians. I guess you are. But you're telling them things that they overlook because you pick up examples. Like you had that one thing about trade deficits where you picked up on a Milton Friedman comment. And I bet that's the only time he ever said anything like that, because I never heard that. And all the arguments and wars I've been in over free trade, like in my earlier career, I never heard anyone say, and actually, I won't even be able to remember exactly what it is. You'll know what I'm talking about. But Friedman sort of implied that a deficit is a good thing.
Yeah. You're right. Unfortunately, I can't remember the exact word.
Yeah.
And I also agree with you. It seemed like an unusual error
I think
on his
he
part,
misspoke.
saying something like a country that's running a trade deficit is getting the better of the
it's getting a better deal
because they're getting more goods for less or something.
In all my arguments with the Council for Competitive Economy, and trade was a huge part of that, because this was the last of the Carter years, and Reagan was a protectionist. He was not a free trader, even though he claimed he was. We never said anything like that. We used to say, we used to quote Adam Smith, nothing is more absurd than this whole doctrine of the balance of trade. That there's been deficits in good times and bad times. There's been surpluses in bad times. So, that's not an indicator. I never heard that Friedman statement, but I never heard anyone else say that either. So I learned, even if he only said that one time, you're spelling it out really, I thought made things very clear and should have to your whole audience. So, and you've done that kind of thing more than once. I can't think of examples now. So I really appreciate it. Just go back and look at your emails from me and you'll see what elicited that view from me. Your conversations have been very good. Someday we can talk about secession, because I have some questions and problems with it.
Okay. But, I look forward to that.
Just my schedule is a fairly clear schedule.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, that's probably a good spot for us to wrap up on this particular conversation.
Sure.
So, folks, my guest this week has been Sheldon Richman. So, Sheldon, thanks for your time and your insights and all the work.
This has been such a good time. I could go the rest of the day doing this, but you can't. I really mean it. I'm having
I appreciate that.
That's right. Yes, a lot of fun. I like you a lot. You're a good guy.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I should say, it doesn't surprise me that the left outlets like you, I can't put my finger on it, but you don't come off as like a right-wing crotchety, if the poor are poor, that's because they didn't work hard enough.
I'm not right or left. I hate those terms.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be right or left.
So I think that's why, you seem earnest, and that even people who would be called leftist would let you come on and explain, well, gee, maybe there's a problem with having the Federal Reserve, and not just because you want to exploit the poor or something. So
right, and I've learned so much from you about MMT.
Ah, yes.
Or what I call MMT.
Very good.
But I shouldn't really say that because I don't know enough about it. You do. I've only learned from you. So I have no formal training in economics. So they could probably run rings around me just because I know so little.
Well, the last thing I'll say on that, it is an interesting thing where they're sophisticated enough that that's why I started taking them seriously, is because I saw when people from, quote, our side were just merely mocking them and saying like, oh yeah, just run the printing press, idiots. that wasn't going to be enough because they did have like some decent comebacks and there was a little bit of sophistication in their presentation.
That's your shtick. That's what you do. You go beyond not to sneer and make fun of, and let's look. You're putting yourself in the shoes temporarily.
Yes.
Take it seriously. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Well,
that's why I like your show, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, and that's why I've appreciated your work as well. So, with that, folks, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.